In this video, I'll be providing you with an overall guide on the one 5-star I'm sure everyone has, Dr. Ratio. Going over his strengths and weaknesses, his rotation, how to build him optimally, with his best relics and substats, his best light cones, his best teams, and finally, his eidolons. Alright, let's get started. Dr. Ratio is an imaginary hunt character, and was given out for free because Honkai Star Rail is such an amazing game. It won many awards, including Best Mobile Game of the Year. Dr. Ratio can be played as a hyper carry or sub DPS, and his primary form of DPS comes from his follow-up attacks on debuffed enemies. His basic attack does imaginary damage to a single target. His skill deals imaginary damage to a single target and procs his talent effect, and his talent effect is really good. When using his skill, Dr. Ratio has a 40% fixed chance of launching a follow-up attack against his target, dealing imaginary damage. For each debuff the target enemy has, the fixed chance of launching a follow-up attack is increased by 20%. If the target enemy is defeated before the follow-up attack triggers, the follow-up attack will be directed to a single random enemy. This means when using his skill on a target with 3 debuffs, he has a 100% chance of launching his follow-up attack. His ultimate deals imaginary damage to a single enemy and applies the debuff Wise Man's Folly. When Dr. Ratio's allies attack a target affected by Wise Man's Folly, he launches his follow-up attack one time against this target. Wise Man's Folly can be triggered for up to 2 times. His technique. After using his technique, he creates a special dimension that taunts nearby enemies. After combat starts, the enemy's speed is reduced by 15% for 2 rounds. His major trace effects are Summation. When Dr. Ratio uses his skill, for every debuff on the target, his crit rate increases by 2.5% and crit damage by 5%. This effect can stack up to 6 times. Inference. When his skill is used to attack an enemy, there is a 100% base chance to reduce the target's effect resistance by 10% for 2 turns. Deduction. When dealing damage to a target that has 3 or more debuffs, for each debuff the target has, the damage dealt by Dr. Ratio to this target increases by 10%, up to a maximum of 50%. Dr. Ratio's strengths. He has very good single target DPS. He has high built-in crit rate and damage stats. Active follow-up attacks. You don't have to wait for a shield break or HP bar percentage or even a random lightning god on your turn order. You can activate his follow-up attack whenever you use his skill or when someone attacks an enemy marked with Wise Man's Folly. Dr. Ratio's weaknesses. AoE damage. Skill point hungry. He does far more damage when using his skill to proc his follow-ups. He can kill steal with his ultimate follow-up attack proc. Probably stares at himself, in the mirror, in puddles on the street. I'm guessing the only art he has in his house are pictures and statues of himself. Now for his rotation. Dr. Ratio will do the most damage with his follow-up attack, so we will want to use his skill to proc his follow-up attacks as often as possible, only using his basic when absolutely necessary. His ultimate will need 140 energy. With enough energy regeneration from party buffs, light cones, or an energy rope, you can manage a skill, basic, skill, ultimate rotation. Time to build your Dr. Ratio. First off, his trace priority will look like this. For relic sets, we have 3 options, all relatively close in power. I'm going to recommend going 2-piece Wastelander for the imaginary buff, and 2-piece Ash Blazing for the follow-up buff. This is the best set to go without any special situations. Speaking of special situations, if you can pull off frequent imprisonments, then going 4-piece Wastelanders is slightly better. And for those of you who have only been farming Quantum set, this is the best set when fighting a Quantum weak enemy, while also having a defense down debuff applied to them. If fighting someone without a Quantum weakness, this set will be worse than the other 2 options. For planetary sets, we have 2 good options. My recommended choice is Inert Salsado. I would recommend going this, as it can help when using a crit damage chest piece over a crit rate one. The other option is Space Sealing Station. Only go this if you are over 120% speed. Both of these are great options for Dr. Ratio. The only planetary set better than these is Firmament Frontline, only if you can manage to get over 160 speed. But considering that is extremely difficult, and it's such a fractional increase in damage, I don't recommend farming for this over the others. I would suggest a crit rate or damage chest piece. Because Dr. Ratio receives so many buffs to his crit rate, you should try to go for a crit damage chest piece. Speed or attack percent boots, imaginary sphere, and attack percent link rope. I would only go energy regeneration link rope if you have no other form of energy regeneration and are not using Dr. Ratio as a hyper carry. Before I go into the next section, light cones, if you are enjoying this and finding this video informative, please like and subscribe. Dr. Ratio's best light cone, you could have guessed, is his signature light cone, Baptism of Pure Thought. This light cone works perfectly for Dr. Ratio's kit by providing a crit damage buff when fighting debuffed enemies and providing a huge buff to the user's follow-up attacks after an ultimate is used. His second best light cone is Topaz's signature, which buffs crit and follow-up attacks. But those who have that cone probably also have Topaz, and considering these two work very well together, I would suggest you keep Topaz's signature light cone on Topaz. A much easier light cone to acquire will be Cruising in the Stellar Sea, which you can get from the Herta shop, or Only Silence Remains as the best 4-star option. If you are a new player and have none of these cones, the 3-star option will be Darting Arrow. In this next section, I'll be going over teams and synergies. There are two main priorities for Dr. Ratio to build around, and that is his need to attack units who have been debuffed, and that a large chunk of his damage comes from his follow-up attacks. So I think it goes without saying, but I guess I'll say it. Topaz will synergize very well with buffing his follow-ups, and she also applies a debuff to her target enemy. When it comes to debuffs, there are two units that come to mind that will work extremely well with Dr. Ratio, and those are Silverwolf and Pela. Silverwolf will probably be the best of the two, as her debuffs are extremely strong for single target fights, and that is where Dr. Ratio shines. She can also provide more debuffs than Pela, and the more debuffs you have, the higher chance you have of doing the follow-up attack, as well as stacking your crit damage and crit rate buffs. When looking at sustain units, I would say Ho-Ho is the best healer, as she provides an attack buff and a much needed energy regeneration proc. And on top of all of that, can provide another debuff with her technique. Fushuan is also a good sustain unit, but considering Dr. Ratio gets so many crit rate buffs from his traits and many of his light cones, Fushuan's crit damage buff starts to see diminishing returns. However, she could be used to help your crit rate when using a crit damage chest piece. Locha is an amazing healer, is very skill point positive, and can be a good option when fighting very damaging AoE fights, or if using a skill point hungry team. Lynx is what I will recommend as a good free-to-play option. She is amazing at removing debuffs on your team. Good harmony units for Dr. Ratio are Rune Mei, basically because she works extremely well with everyone. Bronya for hyper carry teams, as long as your other two units are skill point positive. Tingyun because Dr. Ratio requires a lot of energy for his ultimate. And finally, Yukong because she buffs crit and because she is imaginary and can use Planetary Rendezvous and Panaconi, Land of Dreams, to increase Dr. Ratio's damage even further. For a dual DPS team, I would go Dr. Ratio, Topaz, Silverwolf, and Ho-Ho, or Fushuan. You can replace Silverwolf with Rune Mei, as her ultimate places a debuff on the target and buffs both DPS on the team. For a mono imaginary team, I would go Dr. Ratio, Yukong, Silverwolf, and Locha. Locha can be replaced with Fushuan or Lynx. And this may seem a bit out of the box, but you can replace your sustain unit with Welt. He is able to lock down a whole enemy team long enough for you to survive, provides an additional debuff, and may work really well in pure fiction. For hyper carry teams, I would go Dr. Ratio, Bronya, Silverwolf, Ho-Ho, or Fushuan. You can replace Bronya with Tingyun or Rune Mei, or Silverwolf with Pela. Some honorable mention synergies are Gwynaifen, who can apply many debuffs, and Gepard or Fire MC using Trend of the Universal Market, which applies a debuff to enemies who attack the user. Now for the final section, Eidolons. His E1, the maximum stackable count for the trace summation, increases by 4. When a battle begins, immediately obtain 4 stacks of summation. This will bring his maximum crit rate with the buff to 25%, and crit damage to 50%. His E2, when his talent follow-up attack hits a target, for every debuff the target has, additionally deals imaginary damage equal to 20% of Dr. Ratio's attack. This effect can be triggered for a maximum of 4 times during each follow-up attack. His E3 increases the level of his ultimate and basic attack. His E4, when triggering the talent, additionally regenerates 15 energy for Dr. Ratio. This is a huge energy buff to Dr. Ratio's follow-up attacks. His E5 increases the level of his skill and talent. His E6 increases the trigger count for Wise Man's Folly by 1. The damage dealt by the talent's follow-up attack is increased by 50%. That's it for this video, and I wish you all luck on your 50/50s.